Hi students, so today we are talking about noticing details to infer character, and this is something we do all the time in real life. When we meet someone new, we sort of pay attention to the things that they do and say, and we notice if there's what they do and say are the same, or if they say one thing but do something different. We also sometimes listen to what other people say about them, and we often take that with a grain of salt, knowing that everyone has their biases, their lens of personal experience, right? That changes how we understand somebody. And we put all that together and we come up with some sort of idea about who this person is. And when we read, we do the same thing, right? We meet a character in a story or a novel, and we notice the things that they do and say. And we notice, again, if there is a difference between what they say and what they do. And in a book, we often have a narrator who might tell us some things about the character. And there might be other characters who have opinions on that character. And we put that all together and we come up with an idea about who they are. And just like with real people, with characters, our opinions can shift over time, especially in a longer work as we learn more about the character. We might change our opinion. Our opinion can sometimes change drastically from the beginning of a novel to the end of a novel. And same thing in real life, right? Sometimes we meet someone and we hate them when we first meet them, but then we get to know them and we realize, oh, maybe they were just shy, or maybe it was a bad day. I was having a bad day and I didn't have a good impression of them. And so our opinion shifts and changes, right? With these shorter stories, we don't really have enough time to see a character shift and change, but we can still sort of begin to understand some things about the character as we read. So to show this to you today, I'm going to use Surrendering by Ocean Vuong, which we read, which you should have already read. And I really love Vuong's writing. He's a contemporary author, so he's writing now. He is, I think, primarily a poet. He's written books of poetry and lots of poems, and he's also written a novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, which I really recommend. It's a beautiful book. He's a beautiful writer in general. The way he uses language is really gorgeous. You can tell that he's a poet from the way that he uses language, and so I strongly recommend reading more of his work. And I just found out today that there's a bunch of videos on YouTube. So if you want to explore more of his writing, that might be a good way to start. So we're going to talk about inferring character. And I'm not going to read the whole story because you have read it already, but I'm just going to pull out some parts of it that I feel like really show us something about his character. So when we start the story, Vuong starts by talking about his background, right, as a English learner, and that his family were illiterate, right, that they don't know how to read. And this part really stands out to me, where he talks about the experience of working through a book, even one as simple as Where the Wild Things Are, was akin to standing in quicksand. Your loved ones corralled at its safe edges, their arms folded in suspicion and doubt as you sink. So first, I learned a lot about his background, right? I learned that his family doesn't read, right? And not only do they not read, they don't think of reading. Reading isn't something that they particularly want to do, or maybe something that doesn't have value for his family. Maybe other things have value. So there's that, right? So reading, literacy is not something that has value for his family, right? It seems like it's viewed as that others do, not them, right? So other people read, they don't. And then he attributes it. He has this like really lovely comparison, saying that it's like standing in quicksand. And I think that that's a really lovely comparison. And I think we learn a lot, right? That reading seems to be dangerous, right? Because it means leaving your family behind, leaving your family. in some sort of a way, which is scary, right? Especially when you're a child, that's really scary because your family sort of, and their values are sort of all you know. And so that tells me that there's an element of independence, right? That Vuong seems to be someone who's has this degree of independence and also bravery, right? Because it takes bravery to sort of step away from tradition. So I would say that this shows me that Vuong is independent and brave. And also he must be really um, perseverant, right? Because this is something that, or very determined, because this is something he's clearly not getting support at home to do this thing called reading, but he clearly figures it out, obviously. So determined, right? So I can kind of gather those things from this idea that his family is not sure of what he's doing. They don't really support it. And so he has to, if this is something he wants to do, he has to do it on his own, right? That's where it's going to come from. So that to me tells me a lot. And I want you to notice that he never once says any of those things about himself, but by just describing his family dynamic and making this really lovely comparison, we understand sort of some information about his character. So let's just read a little bit more. So he talks a little bit about how his family immigrated from Vietnam in the 90s, in 1990 when he was 2, so he was born in Vietnam. And how when he went to school was the first time he learned English, which is super common for most people in the maybe not most, but for lots of people in the United States. That's super, super common. I know that's the case for my husband, that he learned English when he went to school. But then this is the part that I kind of, I pulled out. So he talks about how he didn't learn to read until he was in 4th grade. Or it seems like by the time he was in 4th grade, he still didn't really know how to read. Sorry, there's a plane. And the part that I pulled out was this idea that he pretends like he's doing work. He copies out work and pretends like he's working so that he can sort of hide. And he uses this word camouflage, right, which I think is really interesting. So I have that in my notes, right? And I would instead spend the class mindlessly copying out passages from books I'd retrieved from a blue plastic bin at the back of the room. So mindlessly copying them out, right? So this is meaningless to him as well. The task allowed me to camouflage myself. As long as I looked as though I were doing something smart, my shame and failure were hidden. So I think that this is really interesting because it tells me something about his background, right? That his school is a dangerous place, right? Because he has to camouflage himself, right? We camouflage when we want to hide. So this tells me that his school is not welcoming, or he doesn't feel safe there. And it's really clear too, because he does not read well by the 4th grade. So that tells me that his teachers probably don't see him in any meaningful way and don't help him, don't give him the help he needs. That seems to me really clear, right? Because by 1st grade, you should be reading in some language, or by 2nd grade. And the fact that by 4th grade, he's still not really reading is problematic. And you'd think somebody somewhere down the line would be like, oh, this kid still isn't reading, let's like do something, but nobody does anything. So that's problematic. But then also, I think that this shows that he has developed a really, really great sense of sort of this social and emotional intelligence, because he knows what he has to do. He knows what he should be doing, and he knows how to look like he's doing that thing, and he knows how to hide himself, which requires a lot of intelligence, right? Of like looking around, seeing what other people are doing, and mimicking that. And that's actually really smart, right? That requires a lot of intelligence. So I'm going to say he's really socially and emotionally intelligent, and he's like astute, right? He can read, maybe not literally, but he can read people and he can read situations, right? So I'm just going to clarify. He can read people. Oops. He can read people and situations. And we do get the sense situations. And we do get the sense that he feels, so if we're talking about feelings, going back to the last lesson, that he feels ashamed. And it seems like there's this sort of double sense, right? He feels ashamed for wanting to read because that takes him away from his family, but he also feels ashamed that he can't read because that's what the dominant culture does, right? So he is in this like, he's in between, right? He's sort of stuck between these two needs of needing to read to fit in with the dominant culture and succeed in the dominant culture. And then, but that reading will take him away from his family, right? So I'm just going to write that. He's stuck. Okay, and so then the story goes on, and he talks about how he decides to write a poem. And I love the way he says it. He decides to be dangerously ambitious, right? And so that danger is sort of double, right? The danger is that he is stepping away from his family's traditions, but also, or his family's culture, and that also he is taking off his camouflage and he's going to show himself for what he can do. And that's a really scary and very vulnerable position. And certainly it seems like at the school he's in, not a safe thing to do, right? Because he talks later about how he's bullied, and even the teacher, once he sees the poem, kind of bullies him, or definitely bullies him, not kind of bullies him. And this is such a beautiful paragraph and really heartbreaking, right? You can really feel the pain that he felt by being doubted. And I love how he talks about going, I mean, you do hear that he's bullied, but I love how he talks about going to the library and listening to Dr. King's words, and that he thinks that the words must have medicine and the power to heal. And I think that that's such a beautiful sentiment. And so then, anyways, but then he goes on to talk about how he did learn, right? So he is thinking about himself as if he doesn't have anything, but then he realizes that he has so much. And he watches shows with his grandmother, gardening shows, and from that he learns all these words for these flowers that he's never seen, that he has no experience of, and yet he's able to take that knowledge and put it in a poem. And that really tells me a lot about who he is as a person. So just that he'd learned these words of flowers he'd never seen in person, and that he can use them, that requires a lot of intelligence and a lot of like that requires a lot of linguistic intelligence, right? Because you hear the word, you've never seen it, you see maybe a picture, but then you know how to use it correctly, and you know its context, and that requires a lot of linguistic intelligence. So he is really intelligent, and I would say he's really he's resourceful and determined, because he's using everything he has, right? He's using all of the skills he has. So he listens to speeches, right? So he can't read, but he can listen, and he uses that to like acquire some knowledge of how words go together in English. And then he watches TV with his grandmother, and he uses that to learn some more things. And he manages to finally put that all together, synthesize all that information, which is really a challenging thing to do, especially when you're young. And he makes a poem, and that's just, to me, really amazing. I think he's resourceful and determined, and he's also really creative. So anyways, what I think is so lovely about this story in general, beyond the message, because I love the message of this story, and I love the theme sort of that even if the dominant culture that we live in doesn't recognize your strengths and your knowledge and the thing, if they don't value, maybe they don't value the things that you have, but that you can value that, and that you can find your own, the wealth inside of you. And I love that that's the message of this story, right? That maybe his school doesn't see his value, but he finds it for himself, and he finds value in, maybe his grandmother can't read, but she can tell him stories, and that those stories have informed the way that he thinks about telling stories, and that he can watch TV shows about gardening, and he can use all of that richness that he has inside of himself to create beautiful poetry. So, but I think the thing that I also love about the story is that in the story, Wong never says, oh, I'm super determined, I do this and that, or I'm really intelligent, or I'm really resourceful. He never says any of that. But throughout the story, through the details that he gives us about how his family doesn't read, but he does learn, or about how he has to camouflage himself in his school to hide the fact that he can't read, or the fact that he learns words from a TV show and then uses them to write a poem. All of these little details really help us understand, get a picture of who he is as a person. So that's what I want you to do. I'm going to post another story in the assignment on Schoology, and I want you to read it and try to think about character. And you can continue to think about, like I did, background and how the character feels as well. But I also want you to start thinking about, what kind of person is this? Like, are they determined? Are they creative? And I'll post maybe a list of some character traits. I normally have that on my wall at school. Um, and you can start to create a dialectical journal for the next story that we're going to read. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.